Thank you to IDFI for bringing together a really lovely group of people. It's great to see some familiar faces and friends from the OGP and the open government community. It's also really nice to be back in Tbilisi when one is not organizing a summit. So thank you to IDFI to take on the organizing mantle. We have a fantastic panel here today, and I'll introduce them in a minute. But just a quick few opening remarks from me. So, the morning panel has very nicely shown us why tackling corruption is so important. And the more we read newspapers and see what's happening on TV, let's also not forget the backdrop of protests we're sitting in around the world. Citizens are coming out on the streets because they are unhappy with the systems of government, and they feel that systems of governance and government public services don't work for them. And one of the key drivers of unjust systems is corruption. Corruption both is a symptom as well as driver and perpetuator of things like inequality, of things like poor delivery of public services, tax system leakages, etc. And so at the OGP, we believe that for any government that's actually serious about open government reforms, tackling corruption is one of the key priorities and must be one of the key priorities. A few trends that we're seeing in OGP, and I hope Jeff will speak to some of this in more detail. Just three things I do want to point out, linking back to the previous panel. One is that corruption is no longer a national issue. And several panelists from the last panel have said it's a transnational issue. The Panama Paradise Papers has shown this, but also they need collective action. And this is why the issue of beneficial ownership we've really seen pick up steam the last couple of years. Now in OGP, we have over 20 countries that are tackling beneficial ownership reform through OGP commitments. In fact, just yesterday, Latvia became the first country to sign on to a group of early adopter countries that includes Ukraine and Armenia to sign on to become part of a beneficial ownership leadership group, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this in the next session. So transnational problem needing transnational solution. That's the one trend that we're seeing. The second is the political corruption angle, and Emilia shared this in the last session a lot, and things like procurement being key drivers of and symptoms of where this corruption manifests itself, but also money in politics. And we've seen good commitments on asset declaration. I mean, Georgia had a good commitment in the past on this, but there is a lot more that needs to be done. About 50 OGP members are making commitments on open contracting, including implementing the open contracting data standard, but there is a lot more that needs to be done. The third trend we're seeing in OGP commitments a little bit is involvement of citizens. Eka mentioned this in the last panel, that it's no longer just saying this is a problem for citizens, it's a problem for citizens, but it is important to really involve citizens in tackling corruption. We're seeing this, and I hope Anastasiya will talk about it a little bit, how Dozoro involves civil society in monitoring contracts. And we're seeing this in places like Nigeria, we're seeing this in places like Italy, where citizens are being brought on to monitor corruption. And I think that is a third important trend we're seeing in OGP, and again, there's a lot more to be done. Just before the last thing I do want to point out that is incredibly important is anti-corruption activists are working in incredibly hard situations. Civicus is bringing out a new report on Monday that shows that only 3% of the world's population lives in free and open societies. Civic space has shrunk so tremendously, and in a lot of countries, anti-corruption activists are the ones that are being tackled. So I think that's an important backdrop to sort of situate this conversation in. So with some of that, I want to hand over to this panel that we have that will share some of their valuable perspectives with you. What we'll do is we'll start with a few opening remarks and a round of questions for me. I'll hand it over to you for a couple of questions and then come back to the panel just to make it a little more interactive. And I've also warned the panel in advance that if they go over time, I'll play some Oscar music. So hopefully they'll keep to time. So I want to start with Jeff, since you have a little bit of a big picture. So Jeff is, the chair of New Diplomacy, and he's also a member of OGP's International Expert Panel that oversees the independent reporting mechanism of OGP. So Jeff, just some opening remarks from you on open government and anti-corruption and how you see the two intersect.
It's working? Great. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's worth putting it into the context of really, I'd say, the Eastern Partnership, because I think that's the focus of most here, Ukraine, Armenia, and Georgia. Clearly, oligarchy and state capture are overriding challenges, and we saw recently, obviously, the short-lived experiment in Moldova, where really a government was formed, a kind of unholy alliance against one oligarch, but obviously it collapsed because the commitment wasn't common when it came to justice reform. And I think that perhaps is one of the things it's worth really focusing on is judicial reform. And I think this is an area where we could see a lot more cooperation. It came up about the role of foreign experts, independent in selection panels in the previous panel. And I think that's something where there are troubleshooters who could be sent who've really made an impact at home, but as stressed, you really need local ownership of that. But I think also, I mean, OGP, the difference is about public participation and engagement. In fact, I was here in Tbilisi just last week, working with Tbilisi City Hall and NGOs on a project in the district of Guldani, which I think is the most populous district in Tbilisi. It was a rather unknown lake in Guldani Park, which is going to be regenerated. And to me, that in itself is not directly about anti-corruption, but the whole focus of getting people more involved, taking more decisions, and instead of starting with, this is what we want to do to regenerate, start by talking to stakeholders, to residents, to really getting more, I'd say, bottom-up instead of top-down approaches. And to me, that is the way, in the long run, you will build up a kind of common mass of not that we can defeat the oligarchs, but we can take, I don't want to say take back control, because that also has negative connotations, but really so that people feel that they're part of the process. So from that point of view, I think there's a lot of opportunity. And I know Georgia, I believe, has a new law on public consultations, which comes into force in 2020. So that's a big opportunity here. I also understand it doesn't really specify which tools should be used for which types of public consultation. So it's actually more of a starting point where the guidelines for public consultations will emerge, but it's a real opportunity for, I'd say, for civil society perhaps to take a lead and have some ownership there. Okay.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks for setting the tone for the panel. I'd like to invite Mr. Giorgi Sakhokia. He's the Chief of Staff, the Office of the Prime Minister and the Government of Georgia. Really glad to have you. Just your initial thoughts on intersection of open government and anti-corruption and where you think they leverage each other or support the agenda.
Madluba, მოგესალმებით პირველ რიგში. მოხარული ვარ რომ საქართველოს მასპინძლობს კარგი მართლობის ფორუმს და ვფიქრობ რომ ეს არის ძალიან კარგი პლატფორმა კორუფციის წინააღმდეგ მიმართული ღონისძიებების გაერთიანებისთვის. მინდა აღვნიშნო რომ კორუფციის წინააღმდეგ ბრძოლა წარმოადგენს საქართველოს მთავრობის უპირობო პრიორიტეტს და გამჭვირვალე და ანგარიშვალდებული საჯარო მმართველობის ჩამოყალიბებისთვის და ასევე კორუფციისგან დაცრილი გარემოს შექმნისთვის არაერთი მნიშვნელოვანი ნაბიჯი გარადგა ქვეყანამ ბოლო წლების განმავლობაში, როგორიც არის მაგალითად პოლიტიკური პარტიების დაფინანსების გამჭვირვალობის ზრდა, სახელმწიფო შესყიდვების სფეროში განხორციელებული რეფორმები, ასევე საჯარო სერვისების მიწოდების გაუმჯობესება, საბაჟო და საგარასახადო სფეროების გაუმჯობესება და ასევე შემუშავდა და დაინერგა საჯარო სამსახურის შესახებ ახალი კანონი, რომელმაც ახალ საფეხურზე უნდა აიყვანოს სრულიად საჯარო მმართველობა. ქვეყანაში ანტიკორუფციული პოლიტიკის რეალური შედეგები შეგვიძლია ვნახოთ სხვადასხვა კვლევებში თუ საერთაშორისო რეიტინგებში, როგორც არის მაგალითად საერთაშორისო გამჭვირვალობის კორუფციის აღქმის ინდექსი 18 წლის მდგომარეობით აღმოსავლეთ ევროპის და შუა აზიის ქვეყნებში პირველ ადგილს ვიკავებდით. ასევე ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანია კანონის უზენაესობის ინდექსი, სადაც ასევე ჩვენი რეგიონის მასშტაბით პირველ ადგილზეა ქვეყანა წარმოდგენილი, ღია ბიუჯეტის ინდექსი, ასევე სადაც 115 ქვეყანაში მეხუთე ადგილზეა საქართველო და მსოფლიო ბანკის ბიზნესის კეთების ინდექსი, რომელზეც უკვე ტრადიციულად მოწინავე ადგილებს იკავებს ჩვენი ქვეყანა. აქვე მინდა გადავიდე უკვე OGP-ის ღია მმართველობის პარტნიორობის და საჯარო მმართველობის რეფორმაზე. საქართველოს მთავრობის მთავარი ამოცანები ამ მიმართულებით არის გამჭვირვალობის და ანგარიშვალდებულობის მაღალი დონის მიღწევა, საჯარო ინფორმაციაზე ხელმისაწვდომობის მაღალი ხარისხის უზრუნველყოფა, მოქალაქეთა თანამონაწილეობის და ჩართულობის გაზრდა როგორც მმართველობის, ასევე გადაწყვეტილების მიღების პროცესში, კორუფციის პრევენციის მექანიზმების გაუმჯობესება და აქვე მინდა ვთქვა, რომ პარის და OGP-ის რეფორმის ფარგლებში რეფორმა მიმდინარეობს სამოქალაქო საზოგადოების და ასევე საერთაშორისო ორგანიზაციების აქტიური ჩართულობით. OGP-ის ფარგლებში განხორციელებული რეფორმებიდან, რაც გატარდა, მინდა გამოვყო ქონების დეკლარაციების მონიტორინგის სისტემა, რომელიც საჯარო სამსახურის ბიუროს ბაზაზე ფუნქციონირებს, ასევე ინოვაციური ბიუჯეტის მონიტორინგის ელექტრონული მექანიზმი, რომელმაც გაეროს მსოფლიო სამიტის და ფისკალური გამჭვირვალობის გლობალური ინიციატივის ჯილდოები დაიმსახურა, ასევე ელექტრონული პეტიციების პორტალი iChange.g, რომელიც გუშინ სხვათა შორის პირველი პეტიცია გაიარა ყველა საჭირო ეტაპი და შეაგროვა 10,000 ხელმოწერაზე მეტი და უკვე დარეგისტრირდა როგორც დაკმაყოფილებული პეტიცია. თუმცა ჩვენ იმის გათვალისწინებით, რომ 10,000 პეტიცია საკმაოდ ბევრი იყო, შევიტანეთ ცვლილება და 1 იანვრიდან პეტიციების ხელმოწერების რაოდენობა პეტიციაზე 10,000-დან 5,000 ერთეულზე ჩამოვიდა, რომელიც 1 იანვრიდან შევა ძალაში. ასევე ღია მმართველობის პორტალი data.gov.g, რომელიც მეტად მნიშვნელოვანია საჯარო ინფორმაციის ხელმისაწვდომობის კუთხით და აქვე მინდა აღვნიშნო ერთი ფანჯრის პრინციპით საჯარო სერვისების მიწოდება, რომელიც სრულად გათავისუფლდა ბიუროკრატიული სხვადასხვა მექანიზმებისგან და 400-მდე სერვისის მიღება შეიძლება დღეს და რაც ყველაზე მნიშვნელოვანია, ეს შეიძლება ასევე განხორციელდეს საზოგადოებრივი ცენტრების მეშვეობით და რეგიონების ჩართულობა მეტად მნიშვნელოვანია. Tarjimani, translation? Yeah. Okay. და აქვე ბოლოს ვიტყვი, რომ დღეის მდგომარეობით უკვე მუშაობთ ღია მმართველობა საქართველოს ახალი სამოქმედო გეგმის შემუშავებაზე და გვინდა რომ ეს გეგმა იყოს ბევრად უფრო ამბიციური, ამბიციურში არ გულისხმობ აქტივობების რაოდენობას, არამედ გვინდა რომ რამოდენიმე ძალიან მსხვილი აქტივობა მოვიცვათ და შედეგი, რომელიც გეგმის დასრულებისას უნდა გქონდეს, იყოს მართლა შთამბეჭდავი და ხელშესახები. დიდი მადლობა.
Thank you. That's a really great way to sort of show the Georgian landscape progress in budgeting and procurement, and but also the reforms that you're discussing on the current OGP forum. Really appreciate those. Thank you. Before coming back to Georgia and coming to Giorgi, I want to go to Anastasiya. So Anastasiya Kozlovtseva is the head of international relations at TI Ukraine. She's a friend for many of us and is a familiar face in the region and globally who's spoken about these issues. Your initial thoughts on the Ukraine's experience on leveraging open government approaches for anti-corruption?
Thank you, Tonu. Ukraine has joined Open Government Partnership in 2012, was one of the first countries, and since then Ukraine has advanced in anti-corruption a lot. We had the Revolution of Dignity, the anti-corruption infrastructure, meaning the agencies which are supposed to fight corruption, investigate corruption, prosecute corruption, were launched. According to our Open Government Partnership action plans, some highlights which we were able to achieve were joining beneficial ownership transparency. Ukraine was one of the first countries and the first who signed the memorandum with open ownership on sharing the data. Also, of course, everyone knows ProZorro, making public tenders and public procurement starting from the paper, then transferred to the electronic platform, which was also one of the commitments in our action plans. And digitalization in general, opening many registries including asset declaration registry. However, if I say that open government partnership was a key initiative which made these changes, I would lie to you. But what is open government partnership for Ukraine and why open governance is needed? The things which I mentioned gives transparency to public procurement or asset declarations and so on. And I like to say that transparency is the first step, but then accountability needs to follow. What Open Government Partnership as an initiative did to Ukraine in the anti-corruption and also other areas, I would say, first of all, it's a catalyzer for some of the reforms. So those reforms which were initiated by civil society or the government, in order to make them better and to make them faster, Open Government Partnership was something which helped us. Also linking Ukraine to the global experience and helping to establish the relationship with open ownership or open contracting partnership and so on, which help us to implement these reforms, was another thing. And one important thing is also recognition of the success, because even though we talk about ProZorro, which was implemented in Ukraine, had great success. However, there are still attacks in the legislative documents trying to take out some of the procurements from ProZorro. Having this recognition from Open Government Partnership, winning the awards of Open Government Summit helps Ukraine to preserve some of the reforms which we managed to achieve. However, the problem in Ukraine with Open Government Partnership, I would say, is lack of leadership in Open Government Partnership from the side of the government. If in many countries we say engage in civil society, in Ukraine, civil society tries to engage the government to Open Government Partnership since 2012. And in the last few months, the Ukrainian leadership changed. And as I know, we still do not have a person who's responsible for OGP in Ukraine, unfortunately. So these are my opening remarks, some of the good things, some of the things which we need to work on, but for sure, I would say that we do not regret joining Open Government Partnership in Ukraine. And in different countries, it may bring value in different areas which we might not expect, or maybe it is not envisioned in the beginning to bring value to.
So, Nastya, great honest comments on both the approaches, the transparency approaches and where they help, but where OGP both is strong and weak in Ukraine. Giorgi, sort of reflecting on Mr. Sakhokia's earlier comments on Georgia, but just your overall aspect of where open government approaches have helped. Giorgi Oniani is the Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International Georgia, and is also part of the chair of the forum for OGP in Georgia, and has worked on these issues for several years now.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and thanks to IDFI for organizing this and bringing too many friends and familiar faces and also new faces to Tbilisi to discuss those important issues which, well, they are important for Georgia at least. Like OGP is generally a great initiative that started with President Obama, and the idea was to really build on and kind of encapsulate the whole range of efforts with regards to the open governance, open government in different forms. And it started pretty well, and it spread across lots of countries. And obviously, as any global initiative, there is not always a kind of a rosy road. You have the thorns as well. So I guess the Georgia's case is probably the best kind of the lessons learned scenario, if any can be. And it was also mentioned in the previous panel as well, by previous panelists, that Georgia at some point was as a role model for the region. Like we were the front runners in making anti-corruption reforms and others, and we really managed to effectively tackle petty corruption and some of the other things as well. But when the time passes, or the governments change, or the initiative is no longer there, or the will is not longer there, I don't know. I mean, many reasons can be there, but you can very vividly see the deterioration in those achievements, but also in the ambition to aspire for more. And unfortunately, that was the thing what happened in Georgia. Like, as all of you probably know, Georgia was the chair of the OGP last year. And quite sadly, it was exactly the chairmanship year when in the assessment of the civil society, Georgia had I would say the biggest regress in OGP. It was exactly when the civil society decided to leave the forum, the OGP forum, and then we quite harshly made some critical statements on basically lack of progress which we saw there. The thing is that very often, and probably in all of the countries, any initiatives by the government agencies or by the governments themselves are very much tied to the people and personalities who drive those changes. And we tend to somehow blame this lack of progress or this regress to the personality of the justice minister, who is still the justice minister and who was absolutely non-instrumental, to say the least, in the OGP process. And as a result, we got the situation when the civil society saw ourselves in the position when we were basically, the part of some show, and we were kind of there for the government to mark some tick boxes there and to justify whatever they were doing or whatever they were not doing. Since then, and that was the climax of that process was exactly last year, the November, December, starting from September basically, and by the end of the year. And since then, we had one major achievement. The OGP Secretariat has been moved to the government, and I'm glad to hear now that Mr. Sakhokia shows this commitment towards OGP, representing the Prime Minister's office. But it's also the fact that almost a year passed and there is no progress on anything at all. I understand that, and for those who don't know, the new Prime Minister has just assumed his post just several months ago, I guess, and then they didn't have the chance to follow up. But I mean, overall, that's the same government, same ruling party, same ownership on all those issues. And for the last year, we had seen some process, but no progress. And that's basically the main the main obstacle also looking ahead. We don't want to be, and I think the government saw that the Georgian civil society does not want to be engaged in any process where we don't see a very tangible result. Those things that were mentioned by Mr. Sakhokia, they are important to some. They might be important, but they're not that important to us. I mean, there are lots of very tangible, very specific things which Georgia can do in terms of OGP, and we don't see it yet doing. So now the ball is clearly on the government side, and we're expecting some specific deliverables. We already had the first meeting, just to wrap up here. We already had the first meeting with the government. That was a pretty good one. We planned some further steps, but let's see how it goes. Thanks.
Thank you, Giorgi, and I don't want to lose this thread of conversation, and we'll have a chance to come back and discuss this a little more. So just like one more round before I go to some audience questions. Jeff, back to you. You know, we've heard a little bit about the politics of policy making as a lot of countries say elections happen, transitions happen. But you, from the perspective of looking through the IRM and the growth of reports that you've seen, what are some key anti-corruption areas where you've seen ambitious commitments happen? And where do you think there is untapped potential and you think it just scratches the surface?
Yeah. I think, I mean, some of those you mentioned in your introduction. I mean, certainly I think we're seeing a lot more, as you said, beneficial ownership, open contracting, asset declarations, even some on whistleblower protection. I think Georgia is one of those that hasn't had a beneficial ownership commitment yet, if I'm right. So I think that might be something which could come out of this event is some kind of impetus to build on that, because there's such a wealth now of experience on beneficial ownership. I think this is where perhaps we can see more regional cooperation. And I think perhaps OGP, I can imagine OGP will be moving to, in a sense, having a knowledge bank, looking at what works and what doesn't work in different areas. And I know in the strategy for local government or local action plans, there is the idea of a toolkit will emerge over time. So I think we should be looking at much more kind of cross-fertilization, learning from one another. I mean, I think also it's not just within this region. I know on the judiciary, Colombia has had some experience. It went beyond kind of case histories of judges also looking at conflict of interest, potential conflict of interest. And I think perhaps commitments like that could come in here. I think one of the concerns about OGP action plans and the commitments is often the vagueness of the commitments, that it's not clear really whether there is an enforcement mechanism. Very often there's no sanctions to back up. Whether it's, for instance, it can apply for asset declarations and many other. And I think that's where perhaps the engagement of civil society can really push and say, come on, let's be really clear what we're trying to achieve with this commitment. Obviously, some commitments are not even OGP relevant. It's not clear what their relevance is. They're often perhaps more technical. But I think when it's clear what the focus is, there has to be, well, what happens if this isn't implemented? Are there sanctions for public officials who don't declare their assets? And what are they? And I think it has to be very clear that there is going to be enforcement. And as I think I mentioned on justice reform, I really think there's a scope for more commitments on reform of the judiciary and the prosecution service, particularly ones where you're going a lot further than just saying, okay, we want to have independence. There have been a number of commitments where you've seen civil society involved in the selection of judges and prosecutors, and certainly I know it's been an issue in Georgia. It's been a big issue in Moldova with the recent collapse of Maya Sandu's government. So I think those are some of the areas where I think we can see more scope. But I think perhaps broader than OGP is the role of anti-corruption coalitions. And despite, I guess, the setback in Moldova, certainly the anti-corruption movements, both NGOs and the movement which became part of the governing ACUM party, hasn't died, and I think that will be sustained. And I think perhaps there could be more attempts to find ways of broadening the interest in fighting corruption. And I think it's come up the idea of the need for new faces, not just in the judiciary, but I think in political forces, political groupings, where you have people who are not tied to oligarchic groupings, and it's, to be honest, this is something which we're seeing everywhere. I mean, I live in the Czech Republic, and many of the local election winners were not the national parties. They were like Prague 10. The mayor of Prague is actually from the Pirates. The second party was Prague for itself. The leading opposition party in the polls is now the Pirates in the Czech Republic. And it's because people have had enough of the corrupt ruling parties. And that doesn't mean that everybody in the governing parties or the main parties doesn't have a place. But I think it really is time to see far more new initiatives. And I think we have to accept, and I think Georgia has led on the fluidity between civil society and government, both with the previous government, the UNM, and the Georgian Dream. Quite a lot of people from civil society went into government. And quite a lot of them have gone back into civil society, like Ucha, the former ombudsman here, has gone back into civil society. Giorgi, who was education minister, has. And of course, Georgia has even exported ministers to other countries, and not just ministers, but law enforcement officials. So I think maybe some cooperation on commitments across countries, saying, let's get some leverage here. And this ties into this thing of international experts. There's a lot of international experts can be sent from the Eastern Partnership countries. You've actually got a lot more experience than some of the, perhaps, judges from small Northern European countries who perhaps haven't really been at the cutting edge and don't quite understand the challenges faced. Thank you.
Jeff, there are a lot there to think about. The judicial reform area, certainly bringing in citizens' local beneficial ownership and working with civil society coalitions. Mr. Sakhokia, to you now. I mean, Georgia was the former chair of OGP. As we just spoke, we hosted a global summit last year. And during your chair year, one of the things that you championed was the anti-corruption agenda, encouraging OGP members to show domestic ambition. In your forthcoming action plan, as well as collaboration with civil society, what are some next-generation anti-corruption reforms you hope to do, building on some of the successes you shared earlier?
სამომავლო მიმართულებას რაც შეეხება პირველ რიგში მინდა ვთქვა შევეხო გიორგის ნათქვამს წინაზე რომ საკოორდინაციო მექანიზმი გაზაფხულიდან უკვე არის მთავრობის ადმინისტრაციაში OGP-ს და ამ ეტაპზე ჩვენ მუშაობთ სამოქალაქო საზოგადოებასთან რომ გავაანალიზოთ ის გამოწვევები და საჭიროებები რაც გვაქვს ხვალინდელი დღისთვის შესასრულებელი აქვე პირველი რაც ესეთი თვალნათელი იყო ეს იყო რომ საკმარისი როგორ ვთქვათ დონე ლეველი არ იყო საკმარისი და უკვე შემუშავებული გვაქვს მაღალი დონის OGP-ის საბჭო სადაც სამოქალაქო საზოგადოება არასამთავრობო ორგანიზაციები ჩართული იქნებიან როგორც სრულფასოვანი წევრები, ну, დღევანდელ დრაფტში ეს ვერსია გვაქვს, რომელსაც თანხმდებით მუშა პროცესია არასამთავრობოებთან და სრულფასოვანი წევრები იქნებიან, რაც ჩემ პრაქტიკაში არ ყოფილა ესეთი პრეცედენტი და ამ მაღალი დონის საბჭოს მეშვეობით უკვე მოხდება მომავალი 2 წლის სამუშაო გეგმაზე მუშაობა. ახლა ვართ დამასრულებელ ფაზაში 18-19 წლების სამუშაო გეგმის და შემდგომი 2 წლის სამუშაო გეგმაში გვინდა რომ როგორც წინაზე აღვნიშნე საკმაოდ ესეთი მსხვილი და ამბიციური ამოცანები ჩავდოთ. ასევე მინდა ვთქვა რომ არის ქვეყანაში გვაქვს ანტიკორუფციული საბჭო, რომელიც მაღალი რანგის მაკოორდინირებელი უწყება და ასევე გვინდა რომ OGP-ის პარკლებში გარკვეული ნაბიჯები იყოს გარადგმული ამ საბჭოს გაძლიერებისთვის და ასევე სხვადასხვა კორუფციასთან მებრძოლის სხვადასხვა დანაყოფების უკეთეს კოორდინაციაზე.
Thank you, and particularly interesting to hear about the council and the role that civil society will play there, and Giorgi, keen to hear from you on that when you make your remarks as well. I just want to go back to you, Anastasiya, because I think something that's come up in the earlier round as well is how civil society and government work together through their OGP sort of areas, and you touched on it in your last answer, and you know, we have several friends from UK and over here who've used OGP very tactfully on beneficial ownership, on joining EITI, furthering EITI reform, open contracting. But we all know governments and civil society working together is hard at the worst of times, and is good when it works. So what has worked in Ukraine's case, and what has room for improvement?
Thank you. This is a great question, and I hope it will give some inspiration and some lessons which can be used in other countries to view the audience who is here today. One thing which probably is in some case unique in Ukraine and which worked well is approach of co-governance when we are implementing reforms. Again, Prozoro, it was developed on the basis of civil society of Transparency International Ukraine and then transferred to the government. And until now, there is an expert group which involves members of the state enterprise Prozoro who are responsible for this electronic platform, members of business community, civil society, controlling bodies, government officials from Ministry of Economic Development who are responsible. And this expert group together thinks of the new legislative initiatives which should be implemented in order to make the Prozoro more effective, and so on and so forth. But on the civil society side, it requires the ability and the willingness to take responsibility on something. We are not the watchdog anymore or criticizing and controlling, but we are also stepping in and working together with the government officials in order to implement reforms. And this worked well. But it also gives an opportunity to manipulation and some kind of like a conflict of interest, because if we as civil society gave a lot of effort into implementing some reform or anti-corruption initiative, then it is harder for us to criticize it when we see some pitfalls there. So maintaining this objectivity, the same with National Anti-Corruption Bureau and other anti-corruption agencies which were launched in Ukraine. Civil society played the leading role there. However, now we see that some of them are not effective. It's also the case for the donors. Many money from donor community goes to implement some reforms, to invest in the launch of anti-corruption bodies, systems, registries, but then when it's not work, it's hard to criticize. So we need to keep in mind that the effectiveness and the best interest of people, general population, and also it includes us, should be at the core. And if we make mistakes, we should talk about it. And if we implemented something and now it doesn't work or needs room for improvement, we need to admit it. Another thing is, which worked in Ukraine, and Daria mentioned it in the previous panel, is Ukraine civil society doesn't work by itself when working with the government, but also involving international community and international organizations. When we align our messages and our vision in anti-corruption with embassies, OECD, UN, IMF, and speak with one voice, it's much easier to make the government do this. Third, trust. When trust is lacking between the government, civil society, and the citizens, it's very hard to implement reforms. in Ukraine, to maintain higher trust, we were involving some international experts on the selection boards or participating in the anti-corruption reforms, giving them opportunity to look at the integrity side of the officials which are selected to the anti-corruption bodies and so on. The challenge now in Ukraine, which came because of maybe a good thing, which you would say, the new government, the new parliament is filled now with some previous civil society people. In Ukraine, our previous executive director now is deputy chair of anti-corruption committee in the parliament, and it's the same for the many civil society organizations. However, the civil society leaders who went to work in the government now, not all of them have shifted their understanding that now they're not civil society anymore, now they are part of the government. And they might be reluctant to hear criticism from the civil society. And the mechanisms of civil society participation in Ukraine, I would say, work a bit worse now, the regulated and official channels for participation. But it's more, what works more is personal contacts, because we have them and some civil society are really open to hear us, but it limits space for the general population and for other civil society organizations who do not have these contacts. So yeah, these are some lessons and some good examples from me.
Very reflective, Nastya, thanks. I think the role of civil society as insider, outsider is hard, but also recognizing that sometimes civil society takes up space that actually others could also occupy. I think that's very reflective. Giorgi, coming to you now, I think there's a lot to chew on. Of course, you know, Mr. Sakhokia had talked about some of the big reforms that Georgia has undertaken. You were part of some of the initial OGP action plans. What are some big wins that you've seen that Georgia undertake? I know Eka talked about like petty corruption being tackled here very well, but also some gaps that you now see. Of course, I know you spoke about some in your previous statement, and Eka spoke about the agency. Jeff talked about some big areas like beneficial ownership. So what are some big gaps that remain, but how can you build on some of the big wins you've already seen?
Lots of things have been said, which I would also sign to. And I would start with really commending this step, which was mentioned by Mr. Sakhokia, and that was the change of the format of this OGP forum, making it high level, creating another level upon there with the decision makers there. But I would be cautiously optimistic there again. Like, this is good, this is a very good step forward, but this is still a tool. This is a tool to achieving something tangible and important. And the main still is the political will, which so far, with the previous secretariat or the lead agency with OGP, or to say also with the government, was lacking, and that is the key one. So again, like the ball is there, and one of the tests probably would be again this issue of the high-level anti-corruption agency, which is still in the air here. This is what had been or has been for many years one of the biggest tasks of Georgian civil society, but last year that was the consensus ask from the civil society representatives in the OGP forum. And what we're asking for is exactly to build on basically all the important, the most authoritative institutions' statements or deliberations or Georgian existing anti-corruption reforms, which say that clearly the existing anti-corruption mechanisms are not effective and there is room for improvement, and it should not be under the most closed. So the investigation of the anti-corruption issues now lies with the most closed law enforcement agency, head of which is not even the member of the cabinet. So that's the State Security Agency. And it has also the very innate conflict of interest in the current circumstances of Georgian reality, when its former chief was the former personal bodyguard to the oligarch Mr. Ivanishvili, the informal ruler of this country, and the current chair is also formerly he was also heading one of the institutions or one of the businesses of Mr. Ivanishvili. So the thing is that what we're asking for basically is not just to take our model and do whatever we're saying. And what we're saying, by the way, is the same model that Lithuania has, or Bulgaria, or other Eastern European countries. The countries with probably the same past as we had, more or less the same past and same challenges. So we were asking for the government to take up this model as consideration, conduct a feasibility study, and then start discussion about that. And that was rejected. So that would be an important kind of the important test of how are we really going to have anything, or it would be again just a process for process, which obviously, I mean, the civil society, as far as civil society is concerned, will not be participating in. But as I said, I would end with on an optimistic note, like understanding that this is still the new prime minister, though the same ruling party, but the new prime minister, he might have his own ambitions, and he might be really committed to those to doing something tangible and then more important, and we will be there to support, definitely. Because OGP, what is best with OGP is that you as a government might not be thinking in all your actions through OGP terms, and as Nastya mentioned, I mean, the same was in Georgia, that many reforms which were conducted had nothing to do with OGP. They just, I mean, fit the main purpose, and they were kind of aligned with that. So if you are doing something good and great and important, I mean, OGP is there to give you these congratulations and celebrations on an international level, right? That was what Georgia really did. So if you are committed, if the political will is there, OGP is here to congratulate and celebrate that. If not, I mean, the civil society will not stand there and then continue clapping. Thanks.
So a lot came from the panel. I think there were issues that were brought up on gaps in anti-corruption, some big wins, and also on how government and civil society work together in different contexts. I'll open up for a round of questions, maybe take two before I go back to the panel. So 2 questions from the audience on issues, working together, or general observations from your own countries, but in the form of a question. Do you want to?
Hello, my name is Andres. Most of you know already. I wanted to ask you, actually each panel members, to not only talk about the reforms and problems in their own countries, but also how do they put the information probably online or share with the others, and maybe if OGP has a certain mechanism by which, not necessarily success stories, but also lessons learned, and how do you go about exchanging information so that others who are more or less on the same path, because as Daria mentioned in the previous panel, the learning mode is agile. And as much as we wanted to make it bolder, we learn by doing and learn by mistakes. So how do we jump ahead, and whether or not there is a formal way of learning or reaching out to collect, maybe do comparative analysis real quick on various reforms. Thank you.
Any others before I go to the panel? So people clearly agree with most of what you're saying. So maybe Jeff and Nastya, why don't you start with the question, and then I can fill in with see if Mr. Sakhokia and Giorgi want to add before coming back to your last round.
In OGP, there is IRM, independent reporting mechanism, which publishes the reports on each country, and it's also in English, and it's all on the website of OGP. But of course, it's hard for other countries to browse these IRM reports for each country, finding the topics which are interesting to you. I would say it mostly happens via networks based on the topics. So if we speak about open contracting, there is a network of countries which are working on advancing open contracting, and they share information within this, including countries which work on OGP on this regard. If you are talking about beneficial ownership, I think open ownership does a good job in coordinating and helping out to share the information between the countries on what they are doing. Also, Transparency International, if you are a member of the network, but many countries are, and civil society there collaborate and share the information and experience of their countries, again, on certain topics like whistleblowers, beneficial ownership, open contracting, and so on and so forth. So I would say, and OGP, you have STAR reforms and STAR commitments made. So there are also the opportunity to learn and then to go deeper and ask for contacts of the countries and people who are doing the reforms in certain highlights of the commitments or anti-corruption topics.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot within OGP. I mean, Tonu can probably say more than me. I mean, there's the support unit which advises the contact points on how to more effectively formulate not just commitments, but how to organize the co-creation process. There are training events for the point of contacts, often at the summits and the regional meetings. The IRM reports are not only the standalone reports, there's also a lot of papers come out, for instance, on why commitments fail. There's also papers, there's also now the global report. So there's a lot, there's also the Explorer, through which you can look at how many different commitments there are in particular areas. And there's the working groups on different areas. So there's quite a lot. There's also papers on impact. And obviously on what are the forthcoming thematic priorities. There's the strategy on local government. And I think that I think there will be a lot more focus on local commitments. And that's why I think it's very, I know the last Georgia action plan, the one just wrapped up, had a lot of local commitments. So it's not only that you have the Tbilisi local report, but also there are a lot of local government commitments in the National Action Plan. So there's a lot of scope for exchange and learning. I think maybe there could be some regional initiatives, I think, not just internally, but learning from other regions. And I think perhaps that's an area where the Eastern Partnership region could really have a focus.
I'll just start the last round and maybe get into some of this in the wrap-up as well. I want to go back to some of the issues that were discussed earlier, because I think it came up in the first panel around sort of a lot on grant corruption and political corruption, but also sort of looking at transnational issues. So I want to sort of start, Giorgi, from you this time first. TI wrote something very recently on offshore companies in Georgia and the relevance to Georgia, and Jeff mentioned that beneficial ownership is not a commitment that Georgia has made so far. Is that of relevance to Georgia, and in what ways does that affect, and is that an area you're looking at for future advocacy?
The offshore companies and the shell companies are a problem across the world, and in Georgia's case, in this report which you're referring to, we just found, based on the publicly available information, that there are 3,000-ish offshore companies which are operating in Georgia. I mean, again, this issue, why it's a problem for Georgia? Because it's still connected with this main problem which we're having, the underlying problem of the informal governance and this personality of Mr. Ivanishvili, who is the chair of the ruling party, the richest man, and just saying that he's the richest man doesn't tell you it all. Like, his fortune is more than 30%, 30, of Georgian GDP. And there is no one who can effectively challenge him financially. Like, the next richest guy in Georgia would be probably 10 times, not poorer, but I mean, 10 times, would have 10 times less wealth. And very curiously, or I don't know what adjective to use there, like, this person who really is the guy behind the government, behind all the important decisions, behind appointment and dismissal of the main people in the government. He chooses to store most of his money in offshore companies. Like his name came up in Panama Papers, but also he's doing several business projects in Georgia, quite large ones, and in all of those business projects, the money comes from these Panama offshore companies. Like there are around 9 offshore companies associated with him, which obviously he himself declared that he is connected to them. But like if you are, the question is that if you are the guy behind the government and try to kind of to create best business climate for Georgia, or to show an example to other investors and try to attract others, why would you yourself keep your money in those offshore locations and do those projects through them? Like that's an open question, I would say, the rhetoric one. But you are right. Like one of our previous prime ministers under the same ruling party, he signed this commitment in the London Anti-Corruption Summit. And that's still, the signature is there, but the commitments are still in the air. I mean, nothing has been done. So again, the ball is on the government side.
Great, thanks. And several OGP countries did take forward their London anti-corruption commitments through OGP action plans, so maybe Georgia can follow. Nastya, building on the beneficial ownership issue, so this is something Ukraine has been working on for a while. You know, Olesia are here, and then open contracting is another big issue you mentioned, and Victor, you and several others have been involved there. What is the sort of, what next? Because, you know, a lot of people hold Ukraine to high regard on both these issues, but we all know things are not perfect. So where does the next level of ambition look like on these two issues in Ukraine?
On beneficial ownership, and it's good you mentioned Olesia and Alexei, we have a working group which involves civil society donors, but also all the governmental agencies which are involved and which work with the information on beneficial ownership, in order to work together about the mechanism and the business process which would allow us to verify the beneficial ownership information. So the information is open now in the general registry. The information about beneficial ownership is not yet perfect and structured as we wish it to be, but the work is going on that way. But again, as I mentioned, civil society tries to engage the government. Olesia took a lead on coordination of these efforts of the identifying best process, how to do the verification. One important thing for me, as I am working on international relations in my organization, and within governmental agencies in Ukraine, it's not for some reason as visible, is simple thing. Ukraine has Cyrillic language. And even though we can export our data to open ownership registry, who can find anything on Ukrainian companies if it's all written in Cyrillics? So small thing as transliteration of the information on beneficial ownership, which we have public in Ukraine, would actually help a lot with the integration of this information with others. And also something which I think is pretty unique to Ukraine, in electronic asset declaration registry, the public officials mentioned all the companies where they are beneficial owners, also those which are not registered in Ukraine. And we do not have like a separate registry for that. In the registry where beneficial ownership information is lying, it's only companies which are registered in Ukraine. So the challenge for us is how to work with both of this data and make it usable to prevent money laundering and to integrate with the global register. And Alexei, Renaissance Foundation and also GIZ and other donors are supporting this collaboration and the efforts in strategizing. And I mean, verification of beneficial ownership is the challenge which is not resolved in the whole world. There is no one approach that you do this and this and this and then it works well. So having so many government agencies involved in this, we are trying to make something which would be effective in the long run and sustainable and would work well for Ukraine. On open contracting, Ukraine e-public procurement system Prozoro, great success for Ukraine, but Victor will confirm that OCDS standard, Ukraine does not implement OCDS standard at this time. It lost its name having OCDS standard as full. It has to work on some issues and on the data it publishes and the format of the data which is published, like e-tendering documents. We would like to have e-contracts, which is implemented in Moldova as far as I know, but unfortunately not in Ukraine yet. E-payment connected to Prozoro, electronic controlling, electronic complaints to controlling bodies. This is something which we would like to do. On Dozoro, Dozoro is monitoring of public procurement. It's we call it an ecosystem. It consists of the civil society, community, and IT tools for monitoring. But tomorrow you will have time to hear more about Dozoro. But what we have, what is unique, is we use risk indicators in monitoring the public procurement, and these risk indicators were initiated as a machine learning system. Right now, it doesn't work as we envisioned it, but I think it has great perspectives. Not just identifying most risky tenders using these risk indicators, but also understanding which of these violations or corruption risks in the tenders are we as civil society or governmental agencies are able to prove. So we see that there is a violation, but are we able to prove it? Right now, the risk indicators work more on the showing the violations, but we also can work on machine learning to have this advancement, which would be probably the best example for many countries. On Prozoro Sale is an electronic platform for sales of state property, but now it has its mandate is widened because the legislation was adopted on bankruptcy, privatization. If we have the land market, then land would be sold through Prozoro Sale. But even though some major legislation at the parliamentary level has been adopted, but many bylaws need to be also introduced in order for the system to work well. And it also the same for even National Anti-Corruption Bureau and independent wiretapping, which we were promoting for a long time. The law has been adopted, but it's still not used because of some bylaws and some internal procedures and regulations. So for Ukraine, I would say on the legislative and parliamentary side, a lot has been achieved, but now on the implementation side and accountability side, this is something we need to work in.
Lots of coverage there, and especially around implementation and accountability. I think that's where the gap happens most times. Mr. Sakhokia, to you now. I think sort of we're looking at some big ticket challenges over the next sort of forthcoming couple of years. What are some? I mean, you talked about some of the successes. You also talked about some really good measures you're taking to reestablish the forum and a council. And so, what are some big ticket issues you hope they can unpack? Just sort of reflecting on some of the conversations here.
გამოწვევებს რაც შეეხება რა თქმა უნდა ეს არის პროცესი რომელსაც მუდმივად სჭირდება დახვეწა და განვითარება მთავარი გამოწვევა ესე ცალკე ვერ გამოვყოფ რომელიმე უმთავრეს თუმცა ძირითადი გამოწვევები ალბათ იქნება უფრო მჭიდრო და მეტი კოორდინაცია სამთავრობო, არასამთავრობო და უწყებებს შორის და ასევე სამოქალაქო საზოგადოებასთან უფრო მჭიდრო კომუნიკაცია ასევე ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანი იქნება ცნობიერების ამაღლება საზოგადოების და მათი ჩართულობის როლის უფრო მაღალ ხარისხზე აყვანა, იმიტომ რომ ვფიქრობთ, რომ პრევენციის ნაწილში ეს ერთ-ერთი ყველაზე უფრო ძლიერი მექანიზმია. ასევე მუნიციპალიტეტების ჩართულობა იქნება ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანი ჩვენთვის, როგორც წინაზე ვახსენე, იუსტიციის სამინისტროს ქვეშ არის ანტიკორუფციული საბჭო, თუმცა სრულად არ არის იქ მოცული მუნიციპალიტეტები, ხოლო OGP-ის ფარგლებში 13-მდე მუნიციპალიტეტია ჩართული და შესაბამისად ძალიან კარგი პლატფორმა იქნება, რომ მუნიციპალიტეტებში დეცენტრალიზაცია მოვახდინოთ ანტიკორუფციული პოლიტიკის. ასევე მინდა ვთქვა, რომ არსებული მექანიზმები ქვეყანაში რაც არის ანტიკორუფციული მიმართულებით მომუშავე და მებრძოლი, ეს იქნება ანტიკორუფციული სააგენტო, პროკურატურა, აუდიტის სამსახური თუ საჯარო სამსახურის ბიუროს მონიტორინგის სამსახური დეკლარაციების გამოწვევა იქნება ალბათ მათი ეფექტიანობის მუდმივი მონიტორინგი და შემდგომი გაუმჯობესების როგორც დაგეგმვა, ისე განხორციელება. ეს ამ ციკლის მუდმივად შენარჩუნება, რასაც ვფიქრობ, რომ უახლოესი პერიოდის გამოწვევა იქნება და ალბათ რამოდენიმე საკმაოდ ცხვილი რეფორმა, რომელზედაც ახლა გამიჭირდება საუბარი და ალბათ უკვე საბჭოს ფორმატში იქნება ეს განხილული სამთავრობო საზოგადოებასთან და ასევე სამთავრობო უწყებებთან ერთად.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the forum and the council will be a big part of the next stage of conversations, I gather, on anti-corruption issues. Jeff, take us home. What are some of the big, reflecting, there was a lot unpacked, how government, civil society work together, what are some big issues and challenges we face. But one thing I don't think the panel really unpacked enough is where citizens come in. The last panel talked a lot about, enabling citizens to use data. We talked about citizen monitoring. Mr. Sakhokia spoke about it. Others on the panel spoke about it. There are two stages in OGP, right? So in OGP, we have a lot more local governments who are going to come in and use OGP, and that's another opportunity to bring in citizens. And the OGP co-creation process is one way to bring in more. What are some I think, good approaches or effective approaches that you think could be taken to leverage citizen engagement in tackling corruption, whether grand corruption or petty corruption?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the kind of key phrase is really consult early and consult often. And I think that's applicable to the OGP co-creation process, but also to generally public participation, local planning, and I think more commitments on that would be key, because I think however small an initiative, by bringing people in at an early stage, it also prevents the kind of state capture or even on local stage. I mean, for instance, it's been applied in many countries like Kosovo and Kenya using Minecraft. They use Minecraft to get kids and adults to design what their vision is for their community or their city. And that doesn't look like an anti-corruption initiative, but if you don't do that, you get a kind of blueprint decided on often, specifically with in mind particular developers who are close to those in power. So my view is it's often not the direct anti-corruption initiatives which make it's the low-hanging fruit. If you go for local initiatives, you can achieve a lot. There was in Gdansk, the mayor launched a kind of citizens' assemblies on flood mitigation. Gdansk in Poland has a lot of floods, and the risk is getting higher. And that citizen assembly meant instead of just big tenders for flood defenses and monitoring systems, they did say that was necessary, but also subsidies for citizens for improving their own homes to protect them in terms of water safety. I think there's been a lot of crowdsourcing initiatives which you should be focusing on as well. Certainly it happened last year in Armenia with the action plan, as well as lots of meetings around the country. There was online crowdsourcing of corruption commitments and all OGP commitments. But you've also seen in many countries, partly with participatory budgeting, trying to move the kind of power into the hands of citizens instead of it being decided between planners and big companies, which unfortunately are often related, and I mean even blood relatives of those in power. We see it everywhere. And for instance, you've seen it in Paris, you've seen Madrid decides, where people actually begin to have a stake in terms of voting on how budgets are allocated. So I think a lot of cases like that are really perhaps the way forward, and to make sure that citizens have a lot more say. And I think it comes back again to using participatory public consultation legislation. So I think it would be good, perhaps, again, what I mentioned before, learning from different countries, how the different tools have been used, which contexts it's been most effective, like we heard earlier about online petitions. There are so many different options for public consultations, and you have to see which one fits. Some do these kind of future scenarios. There's so many different options. And the way to make sure, again, that it really is meeting the needs of as many stakeholders as possible, that it's not just planned at times where only people perhaps with jobs where they can take time off in the middle of the day can participate. So it really gets to the communities. Also the weaknesses of online consultations. There are a lot of people, often rural communities, often older people, who really don't get involved and they're not taken into consideration. So on the one hand, public consultation can go further, but I think it's also, I think NGOs really should embrace this, because if you want to have effective anti-corruption commitments, you've got to get in there early. And on the one hand, consultations should be launched early, but you don't have to wait for the governments to do it. And I think this is one of the joys of OGP, that it means that people, citizens, can get together and say, we want this to be on the agenda. And I'm hoping in Georgia, with the new public consultation law and the new kind of impetus for OGP, that we'll see a lot more of that.
Thank you, Jeff. We have time maybe for one question from the floor. And then wrap up. Sigrid, does anyone have a? Otherwise, you can take this. Thank you. She got one already.
Yes. Hi, Sigrid Jacobsen from Tax Justice Network Norway. Giorgio, I was very intrigued by this story about your this very wealthy man in government who was exposed through Panama Papers, having offshore accounts. Now, I was just wondering, because the similar expositions of political people with accounts in Panama, like the Icelandic Prime Minister, he had to step down because of that. So I was just wondering, why is he still in power? Or has there been any reactions, any outcries? Did it have any consequence for him at all on a low or high level?
He's not in power. Like, he does not occupy any elected position. He's just the chair of the ruling party. So he cannot step down from any official position. It's just he's the one who is behind who runs the show. Like, yesterday or the day before, we had the Georgian public was entertained by his televised interview, which was several hours long. And again, he talked as if he's really the ruler, and because he is the ruler. He never mentioned the prime minister, for instance, who is, according to constitution, the one who is behind who should be the head of the government. He talked about the policies which he designed or he decides to implement or not. He talked about the promises by the government, which in effect all of us came to understanding that apparently were not promises. So if you have noticed, there is the demonstrations in the center of Georgia, of Tbilisi, and the main reason for that is the broken promise by the ruling party, which was basically the consensus requests from all the opposition parties, from all the civil society, including this ruling party when they were in opposition, to change the electoral system. So in June we had mass public protests, and then the ruling party and Mr. Ivanishvili himself came out and said that he promised the public to get that they're going to change this, this legislation. And probably after measuring their real ratings in the upcoming, in the wake of upcoming elections, like before the upcoming elections in next October, they decided to drop this promise. Like they staged this situation as if some party members have rebelled, and they, at last point, at last moment, they decided not to vote for that. So, I mean, we are having a classic state capture. The state capture when the richest man in the country, the chair of the ruling party, has tremendous influence over all the state institutions. There is no state institution, probably apart from state audit institution and the ombudsman's office, who can withstand his influence. Others, I mean, nothing comes to my mind. I mean, this is the situation when all the political resources and all the state resources of the government apparatus and all the wealth, the biggest wealth, is within the hands of this one man and one circle. So that is why these electoral changes, which would bring about more fair electoral system, would give chance for to dilute basically this concentration of power through institutional means. And these means and this window is narrowing down, and that this is something which is very problematic basically in the year to come, because we're supposed to have the planned elections next October. Currently there is the political crisis and no one knows how that's going to end, but so basically the upcoming year going to be very, very troubling, I would say.